Greetings and welcome to CivXNow's Advocacy Week primer. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Civics Secures Democracy Act and what you can do to make sure that this generational investment in K-12 civic education at the federal level crosses the finish line this calendar year. My name is Sean Healy. I lead policy and advocacy for the CivXNow Coalition, which is a project of iCivics. 210 organizations strong, 210 plus, very ideologically diverse, geographically diverse. Collectively, we are advocating for stronger K-12 civic education at both the state and the federal level. And delighted that you chose to watch this primer. So a little bit of background on the Civics Secures Democracy Act, then I want to go into some of the kind of the talking points around the bill and specifically questions that we get about the bill as we reach out to congressional offices and try to persuade them to support the bill. So we'll give you some feedback on that. And then ultimately want to end with specific actions that you can take in contacting your members of Congress and ideally even hosting a meeting with your members. So let's talk a little bit about the bill first. Civics Secures Democracy Act was introduced in March 2021. It's a bipartisan bill. I'll speak to that in some more detail in just a second. But more than anything, it's a funding bill. Would bring $1 billion a year to civic education over the course of a 5-year period. Really sets kind of a floor, so it expands access to American history and civics, but a floor by which all students have access to high quality civic learning opportunities, really to make sure that they're able to participate in a meaningful way, in an informed way, in an effective way in our constitutional democracy throughout their lifetimes. And this very much is a long-term investment in the health of our constitutional democracy. So what's in the bill? Well, one, we're really proud to have bipartisan, bicameral co-sponsors. So on the House side, Representatives Rosa DeLauro, Tom Cole, and Earl Blumenauer, bipartisan set of House members, and similarly in the Senate, Senator Chris Coons from Delaware and John Cornyn from Texas support this bill. As I said, it's $1 billion a year. Almost 60% of that money goes to states, so $585 million of it, and 95% of that money has to be passed down to local education agencies, school districts. The one condition is that they participate in an expanded administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics and American History. Important to point out, and I'll come back to this later, that this doesn't mean every student takes NAEP. It's just a larger sample so that we can actually disaggregate how well states are doing relative to one another with respect to civic achievement, knowledge of American history, et cetera. $200 million a year, so 20% of the bill would go to qualified nonprofit organizations through a competitive grants program. Lots of focus here on teacher professional development. We expect actually a lot of the money in that first 80% of the bill that I talked about to be directed towards teacher professional development. But there's also competitive grant funding to higher education, so $150 million a year, 15% of the bill directed to pre-service teachers, and 35% of those funds must go to HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. There's also a $15 million a year program called the Prince Hall Fellowship, which would incentivize people of color to join the ranks of civics and social studies teachers. People of color severely underrepresented in the teacher profession as a whole, teaching profession as a whole, but specifically amongst social studies and civics teachers. As I alluded to earlier, strong data infrastructure here. So the nonprofit grants have to be directed towards innovation and must include project evaluation. There's a call for an update to the NAEP framework, which hasn't been updated in decades, scaling up the administration of that NAEP test. So we're doing it every 2 years versus 4 years, and we're getting back to doing it in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. We've just done it in 8th grade the last couple of iterations. I talked about the state level disaggregation. There's a research piece, $50 million a year to higher education linked to studying K-12 civic education. And then there are one-time investments to strengthen the fellowships for the Madison and Truman fellowships. Madison is for civics teachers to improve their knowledge of the Constitution, and the Truman Fellowship is for folks interested in public service. So those are the bones of the bill. A little more detail about it. Maybe most importantly, and one thing we talked about in every congressional meeting is just currently a lack of investment in civic education. By our estimate, about 5 cents a student invested at the federal level in civics versus $54 a student for STEM. So that $1 billion a year would get us about $18 a student. So it's only about a third of STEM, but as you all know, this would be a game changer for our field in a very positive way. So some of the points we want to drive home as we're reaching out to members of Congress: one, that this is a bipartisan, bicameral group of senators and representatives that found common ground. They work together. We have some revisions to the bill that I'll speak about in these talking points, but collectively they understand how important civic education is to the future of our constitutional democracy. So they work through some tough issues and found common ground. And this exercise is civics at its best, right? So important to point that out. Two, there are some severe threats to our country, both externally and internally. And civics very much is a national security imperative, cribbing here from our friends at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, who've done some incredible work on this, making the case for civics as national security imperative. And encourage you to check out the resources on their website, where they go into much more detail and have done some excellent public programming on it. We're often asked, what does civics mean with respect to the Civics Secures Democracy Act? And the reality is, as civics is defined in the bill, and I encourage you to read the bill, it's a mere 34 pages, but early on in the bill, civics is defined, and it very much is a focus on foundational civic knowledge. So this is a nonpartisan take on what effective civic education is. And once again, it was hatched by this bipartisan group, bicameral group. So there isn't an ideological agenda that we're trying to drive here in terms of content, in terms of pedagogy. This is right down the middle, and it focuses on foundational civic knowledge. We also like to emphasize that the Civics Secures Democracy Act is an exercise in federalism. One, the bill prohibits any imposition of a national curriculum. And two, most of the money flows to states, and states in turn pass it down to districts. That's where decisions about what's taught and how it's taught will be made at the state and the local level. So it very much is an exercise in federalism. So federal funding to states and districts, and those decisions about what is taught, how it's taught, happen at the local level. CSD is an investment in teacher professional development, as I said earlier. And of course, there's a fierce debate going on in our country about how civics and history are taught, the methodologies that we use to teach it. And one thing that we know is when we invest in high quality professional development for teachers from their pre-service experience all the way through retirement, that they have access to high quality ongoing professional development where there's a mixture of content knowledge and also pedagogy, that leads to success in classrooms. And that's specifically what this bill does. This bill very much is an investment in America's civics teachers. Civics is severely underfunded, as we mentioned in the earlier slide, 5 cents to $54. And this really signals its lack of prioritization, specifically to states and to school districts. So certainly not true that civic education receives sufficient funding. That 5 cents to 54 trade-off very much resonates as we talk to congressional offices and members of Congress. We use this civic STEM comparison. By no means are we advocating that funding for STEM be reduced. If anything, we're really just trying to emulate the STEM field. They've been highly successful, and we think a big part of their success is attributed to robust federal investment in STEM, and specifically in STEM teaching and STEM teachers. So we very much want to do the same for civics, but do nothing to detract from STEM. It is critically important to the 21st century economy. We think civics is incredibly important to the future of our democracy. CST does not add to schools' already overwhelming standardized testing burden. Back to the NAEP test, that's the only piece of the bill that talks about testing. And NAEP is a diagnostic no stakes test. So it's a test where an assessment where we get information about what's taught, what works, how well students are doing with respect to civics and American history. And it's administered to a small sample of schools and students. So the overwhelming majority of students in schools in the United States would not be participating in NAEP. So this is not a high stakes standardized test that further adds to that testing burden. They're already overloading schools and districts. So what can you do? And by the way, all of those myth reality slides, you'll find that information on our toolkit, our Civics Cures Democracy Act toolkit, which is on CivXNow.org. And if you'll see one of the options at the top of the screen is the Civics Cures Democracy Act. Slide I'm projecting here shows you the overview of the Civics Cures Democracy Act, where it goes through a lot of the information I have touched upon in this presentation and gives you the opportunity, as demonstrated by the yellow arrow here, to advocate for the bill. And as you click on that button, you'll see some of the talking points that I've touched on here. Also an opportunity to click on the exact bill text and also a summary of the bill that goes into much more detail than I have in this presentation. You'll also see on the screen the two versions of our bill. It's identical, but there's a Senate bill and there's a House bill, and you see the lead sponsors, in this case the Democrats, because they control the respective chambers. There's a take action button that you can click on. Once again, you see some of the key talking points, and what's most critical here is to figure out who your elected officials are. We know the vast majority of you already know them, but type in your street address and zip code, and it'll identify who your senators are and who your US representative is. And we'll lead you to a page like this. My colleague Abby put this slide together. She's a Boston native. So you see her Massachusetts senators and representatives listed here. And this gives you the opportunity to access pre-populated emails and to customize them, or alternatively to make a phone call. We provide the contact information, as you can see in the case of Senator Warren's example here, and you see the email template in the case of Representative Lynch that can be customized. If you do a phone call, there's a little checkbox where we are able to keep track of how well our outreach is going. So please do check that if you make the phone call. Ask you to spread the word on social media. So our online toolkit, once again, offers sample tweets, sample Facebook messages, and then also graphics that can be used on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, respectively. So you just see some of the sample tweets here and the Facebook graphics that can be shared. So please be part of spreading the word about Civics Cures Democracy Act on social. And then finally, want to end here. Over the last few months, we've had more than 6 dozen meetings with congressional offices, and my colleague Abby and I have been bringing in our partners in CivXNow, and specifically classroom teachers from states and districts that the senators and representatives hail from. And I can tell you it's been an incredibly powerful experience. This is a screenshot from last month in Florida, and specifically a meeting with Senator Rubio's office, where we had educators. You can see we even had a couple of classrooms participate, but an incredibly powerful meeting. And to have civics teachers in their natural environments, frankly, talking about the impact of this generational investment in civics has been incredibly powerful. We'd love to host a meeting with you. We can connect you to the relevant staff person in Senate and representatives' offices. I encourage you to contact my colleague, Abby Kaplan, who's our federal policy associate. You see her email, abby.kaplan@icivics.org on the screen. Contact her. We'll work with you to set up a meeting. We'll work with you to bring constituents in. Even happy to do some preparation in advance to kind of mock up what to say in a meeting. Hopefully what I'd said previously in this presentation is helpful to that. And but happy to coach you on that too, and even to be part of the meeting to answer some of the difficult questions that you may come across. So with that, really appreciate your time and attention to this presentation, and most of all, appreciate the advocacy that you're going to pursue as a result of this presentation as part of Advocacy Week. Thank you very much.